to be a worker every day. I want to live every in the way that leads to heaven above, where all is peace and love in the kingdom of the Lord. I will work, I will pray in the vineyard of the Lord. I will work, I will pray, I will labor every day in the vineyard of the Lord. I want to be a worker strong and brave. I want to trust in Jesus, my to save. All who will truly come shall find a happy home in the kingdom of the Lord. I will work, I will pray in the vineyard of the Lord. I will work, I will pray, I will labor every day in the vineyard of the Lord.
This morning, I'll be reading from Proverbs 23, verses 1 through 7. When you sit down to eat with a ruler, consider carefully what is before you, and put a knife to your throat. If you are a man given to appetite, do not desire his delicates, for they are deceptive food. Do not overwork to be rich, because of your own understanding. Cease. You will set your eyes of which that is not, for riches certainly make themselves wings, and fly away like an eagle toward heaven. And do not eat the bread of a miser. Do not desire his delicates, for as he thinks in his heart, so is he. Eat and drink, he says to you, but his heart is not with you.
Let's pray together. Our Heavenly Father, we thank Thee for this Lord's Day. We pray, Heavenly Father, that we lead ourselves to the truth. You be with the teachers, may they have a good revelation of this students as it is. Not less in the get something to teach. Ask your Father to be with those who seek the best and our Lord's faith. Ask you, that Heavenly Father, to be with the elders in the land where you continue to bless them with fruit. Ask your Father to be with the ones who are overseas. You bless them that they be able to come back to us this way. We ask thee now to forgive us our sins, be with us, drive us, lead us. 375. 375. After this song, we're dismissed to our class. I'm pressing on the upward way, new heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I onward bound. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand by faith on heaven's stable land, a higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. My heart has no desire to stay where doubts arise and fears dismay. Though some make way where these abound, my prayer, my aim is higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand by faith on heaven's stable land, a higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. I want to scale the utmost high and catch the gleam of glory bright, but still I'll pray till heaven I found. Lord, lead me on to higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand by faith on heaven's stable land, a higher plane
Good morning. I'll be honest, I was a little concerned that if anybody would show up at all when I said I was going to teach on the genealogy of Jesus. So I tell you, for us, it's one of those things that just doesn't have the meaning it did for the Jews. And every time you kind of start that, I'm going to read through the New Testament, I'm going to read through Matthew, all of a sudden you get to that point, it's like, I can't even say these names. And so it's kind of frustrating. It's kind of even burdensome. But this morning, I want us to talk a little bit about the genealogy of Jesus and why it's important. It was funny when I was talking to Lori. She was talking about her 4-year-old class at school. She said this is just a different kind of class. That they're really smart, and you can tell that they come from homes that study the Bible a lot. But they think on a different level for 4-year-olds. She said, I've been teaching about the birth of Jesus and kind of where Jesus came from. She said, I started getting questions like, and most 4-year-olds just accept whatever you say and they just go on. She said, this class doesn't. She said, the last question is like, so was Jesus the son of God, or was he the son of Joseph? And so she kind of tries to wade through that a little bit. Then so Jesus had 2 daddies. Well, no, he didn't have 2 daddies. So was she married to Joseph, or was she married to God? She's like, how do I explain this to 4-year-olds? How do you get them through that? So she said, it's just been a week. But, I'm glad to know that they come from homes that care so much about teaching them about our Savior, Jesus Christ. And honestly, when it comes to the genealogy of Jesus, sometimes we just need to really look at it to find out, why is it there? Why is it important? Why do we even need to know it? So that's what we're going to do this morning. This morning we're going to talk about the purpose and differences in the 2 genealogies, the genealogy of Matthew and the genealogy in Luke's account. In Matthew's account, we have to remember that this was written to the Jews. So that's why Matthew starts out with a genealogy, because he wants them to understand, hey, let's see for sure if this is the Messiah that's been prophesied about, the one that we're looking for. And let's look and see those prophecies and to see if they come true. And that he was promised through the Jewish heritage. In Matthew 1, it says, the book of genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. It starts out by saying, let's not forget the 2 prophecies we already know. The one that he's going to be of the lineage of David. He's also going to be the lineage of Abraham. It's going to follow all the way through that will lead to Jesus. Being a descendant of Abraham, we see in Genesis 22, verse 18, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Abraham gets this from the angel of the Lord after he's almost sacrificed or attempted to sacrifice Isaac. He's sitting there and this angel comes to him and talks to him, but this is part of the message, is that your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Later on in the New Testament, you see that this passage comes back up. Talks about that. You notice it doesn't say offsprings, but offspring, leading to the Messiah. We also see that the Messiah is going to be a descendant of David. In 2 Samuel 7, verse 16, it says, and which is David's house, and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. This is from the prophet Nathan, when David is wanting to build a temple for God, and God says no. Because you're a man of war, you have blood on your hands, I'm not going to allow you to build me a temple. But part of his message to David is this, is that your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me, and your throne shall be established forever. This prophecy that Jesus, or the Messiah, would come through David. Now, Matthew's account is going to be the legal line through the Jews. One thing we're going to see here in just a few minutes is it's going to be evident that it's not saying that Joseph was the father of Jesus. But legally, all rights and privileges would go to Joseph's son, Jesus, because he was considered his son once he married Mary. So legally, it went from Abraham to David to Jesus. Luke's account's a little different because it's written to the Jews and the Gentiles. The genealogy is a little different, but the purpose of it is to show Jesus' linkage to all mankind by showing Jesus' genealogy that ends with Adam. Because if you remember, obviously, Adam was the first man, but everybody comes from Adam. It changes when we get to Abraham. Then we have the children of Abraham, the Israelites, God's chosen people. But that doesn't mean everybody else is lost. They're still under the patriarchal law. The same law that was given to Adam all those years ago. And that's why it goes all the way back to Adam to show that Jesus, the Savior of the world, is the Savior for all mankind, not just the Jews. So Luke gives the fleshly line through Mary. One thing we need to note, Mary is not mentioned by name, and that's because women are typically not mentioned in genealogies unless they were kind of the side item of they were the wife of, or this child was by whatever woman that's listed. And that's only in Matthew's account. Luke's account does not mention women. But let's talk about the differences between the two. In Matthew's account, it's located at the beginning of the book, where Luke's account is located in chapter 3 after Jesus' baptism. In Matthew's account, he divides it into three different divisions of 14. Now, as we go through that, we're going to notice that things are left out of Matthew's account. But that's because the Jews liked clean, neat divisions. They wanted it to look neat. They wanted it to look purposeful. They wanted people of importance to be on there. Luke's account, there was no division. It goes all the way through. In Matthew's account, it is from Abraham to Jesus, which below you'll see it says the father of, so it descends. It starts at Abraham and goes all the way down. In Luke's account, it's from Jesus all the way down to Adam. So it is Jesus, the son of, and goes all the way through Abraham, Adam, which is the son of God. Matthew's account includes women and brothers. Luke's account, only the ancestors. It is Jesus, the son of Joseph, Joseph, the son of Heli, which we'll talk about that more later, but it'll go all the way through. Matthew's account is a lineage through David's son Solomon. Luke's account, the lineage through David's son Nathan. That's when the two genealogies split. They go two different paths, and we'll talk about why that is in just a few minutes. Really why that is because we will see that Joseph and Mary both come from the same lineage of David. And we need to recognize that, so that we have the legal line, but we also have the fleshly line. And so both make sure the prophecy comes through whichever way, or comes true whichever way you want to look at it. One thing I want you to notice in this next slide, and I know it's not that big, but hopefully you can see, it goes all the way back to Adam, which is a little over 4,000 BC is when they say Adam was created. But it goes through the lineage. And both lineages, actually Luke's lineage goes all the way to Adam and goes to Noah, then all the way to Abraham. That's when Matthew's account begins. Both lineages are the same from Abraham all the way to King David. But that's when they split. At King David, this goes through Nathan, which goes to Mary, and this side goes down through Solomon and goes all the way to Joseph. Now, one thing you'll also notice, in Luke's account, look at how many more names are on this side compared to Matthew's account. That's because Luke does not leave people out of his, where Matthew does. Those are the differences. Now, one thing people will say is, why did Matthew leave people out? You know, that may bother you. But one thing it didn't bother are the Jews. The Jews got this letter from Matthew, his book, and they were looking at it, and it didn't bother them at all that Matthew left people out. And we'll talk about people that he left out, or people that we don't even know about through the lineage all the way to Jesus. Any questions or comments so far? I wouldn't expect any. If I was sitting there in your shoes, I wouldn't have asked any either. So hopefully you're kind of gaining some of this information. Matthew's account. Open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 1. This morning, what we're going to do is just talk a little bit about Matthew's account. We're probably not going to get to Luke's account, so we're just going to settle in on Matthew's account and see what the Jews would have been looking at, what they would have been looking for, and maybe the significance of different people in this account. In Matthew's account, it begins with Abraham. Abraham had a son named Ishmael. Ishmael was the son of a slave woman, Hagar. Now we know in the New Testament it talks about Hagar and Ishmael, and it talks about Isaac and Sarah. And Sarah, or Isaac, was born of Sarah, the woman of promise. And so this is the point I wanted you to realize in this. We don't follow the line of Ishmael. They wanted to make sure everybody understood Abraham is the man of promise, and his promised seed, his promised child, was Isaac. Isaac was the son of the free woman, Sarah, which leads to Jesus, which gives us that freedom of sin. Next we have Jacob. Do you remember what happened with Jacob and Esau? How did Jacob get on this list? What did Esau do? He sold his birthright, didn't he? So that's how Jacob is on this list. And you know, time and time again, how many times does it say that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Why? Because of that event where he sold his birthright. Out of Jacob's sons, you know, in our mind, with all the knowledge we have of Genesis, we would think surely it has to be Joseph, the son that he loved so much. But that's not the next in line. The next in Jesus' line comes from Judah, the fourth son of Jacob by Leah. But Jacob prophesied in Genesis 49, 9, and 10 that Judah would become a kingly tribe. King David and all the others of this genealogy are of which tribe? Judah. They're all of the tribe of Judah, aren't they? That's where they're from. That's where they go. And we'll even study this morning or this evening about Joseph, where he has to go back to when he registers. He has to go back to Judah or Judea to register because he's of the tribe of Judah. Jesus is called the Lion of Judah, isn't he? Because he is from the tribe of Judah. Oh, don't make me go through all of them again. Hopefully this will just happen once. Maybe. Okay. So next we have, which should be Perez, but Judah has his son by Tamar. Do you remember the story of Tamar? Do you remember what happened? Tamar marries Judah's oldest son, and he dies. The second son doesn't want to fulfill the rights of taking her on to make sure she has offspring, and he winds up dying. Well, now Judah has this young son, and he looks at Tamar and he says, listen, what I need you to do is I need you just to go back home, and when he becomes an adult, I will give my son to you. Well, later on, she realizes he's not going to do it. He's not going to give her the son. And so she has a plan. She decides to dress up as a prostitute. And Judah doesn't know who she is. So Judah has twins through his daughter-in-law, Tamar. And when you think about that, do you really think, you're telling me that's the line that Jesus comes from? But it is. It is. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. So her son Perez has a son, Hezron, Jacob's descendant that first went to Egypt. You know, as I was going through this study, it kind of hit me. It's kind of putting all those pieces together. Because now we're to a point that all of a sudden Jacob goes to see Joseph with all of his descendants, and part of his descendants that went is Hezron. Hezron would have been one of the descendants that first went to Egypt with Jacob when Joseph calls all of his family to come to Egypt. Ram would have been one of the firstborn in Egypt. Have you thought about that? That now, as we're going through the lineage of Jesus, that part of his family would have been born. That's part of that Egyptian captivity. So part of Jesus' family tree were slaves. Can you wrap your mind around that a little bit? Because when we are sitting here in America and we think back to the days of slaves, we think about all the awful and hardship, and we think about people who might have been strong, but they weren't the smartest, and they weren't, you just kind of look down on them, and you don't mean to, but I'm going from a mindset of the people like us during that time. They would have thought less of them, and all of a sudden you're thinking of a family tree of the Son of God. He had slaves. For 430 years, they consisted of being slaves. But they did, didn't they? So it continues. Right here's where several generations skip between Ram and Amminadab, because that's during that 430 years of Egyptian slavery. But Amminadab, I didn't know this. Amminadab was Aaron's father-in-law. The Aaron that was with Moses, Moses' brother, that led Israel in the wilderness for 40 years. So, Amminadab, Aaron's father-in-law. Think about that for just a minute. Think about who Aaron was and what he meant to the children of Israel. Because what did he become? He became the mouthpiece for Moses. So he was one at the beginning that was standing before Pharaoh. But after they had gone through, he became the first what? High priest. He was the first high priest. And Amminadab, that was his son-in-law. So his daughter was married to Aaron. Nahshon, leader of the tribe of Judah during the Exodus from Egypt. So as this family tree is going down, we have now a leader of the tribe of Judah. Oh, it is going to do it. I'm really sorry. So he has a son, Salmon. Apparently fought in the conquest of Canaan under Joshua. So now we've gotten the 40 years in the wilderness. Now we've come through the wilderness, and now it's time to go into the promised land. Now we have Salmon, who's leading his people in this conquest. You understand that they went in to Canaan to overcome all these people. Salmon's one of those people who's leading that charge. And we know where Judah is. Have Galilee, Samaria, and underneath that's Judah, which is Jerusalem and Bethlehem and all that area. And do you know who he marries after the conquest? Rahab. Who was Rahab? What was she known for? She was a prostitute. She hid the spies. A harlot from Jericho that hid the spies of Joshua 2. She's also listed in Hebrews 11:31. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. But now, let's go back to whose genealogy this is. Jesus. There's a prostitute in his line. Would you not have looked back over time and said, he's surely not coming from them? Not that side. Not on the prostitute side. Surely not. God thought otherwise. Boaz and Ruth. So now when you think about Salmon and he marries a prostitute, they have a son named Boaz. Have you ever thought about how that might make that story make a little bit more sense? So we have Ruth, Moabite woman, Gentile, marries the son of Naomi. And all of a sudden, her husband dies, 2 sons die, and there's Ruth. And Ruth makes that great promise, I'll go wherever you go, where you stay, I'll stay, my house is your house, your God's my God, I'll do whatever, I'm not leaving you. And then she comes back. And then all of a sudden, Boaz notices her. Now, why isn't Boaz married or promised to someone, or maybe it's pretty hard to get anybody to commit to the person who has a mom who used to be a prostitute. Maybe she's changed, but still, do you get past that? Do people stop looking at you a certain way? I don't know. I mean, they're human like we're human, as much as I would Hate to think it, but we struggle with those things sometimes, don't we? Sometimes it's hard for us to forgive people of their past. But there was somebody else who was closer to the family who could have taken Ruth. And Boaz goes to him and says, hey, do you want her to be your wife? You're next in line. And he says no. And so that is how they became married. So, then we go to Obed to Jesse. There's going to be several generations that are not listed as Obed was not the direct father. I should say Obed was not the direct father of Jesse. For a long time, I looked at this and I said, hey, you know what? Let's look at this. And you know what? David's great-great-grandfather is Boaz. And I would look at those things, and his great-great-great-grandmother was Rahab. But that's not true. There's several generations. I think that Obed was actually his great-great-great-great-grandfather. So we have about 4 generations that skipped during this time. So a few hundred years are listed during the time of the judges. All right, so that's the next point. Obed. See, they've just come out of the promised land. Rahab was in Jericho, hid the spies. Then you have Boaz and Ruth, and then Obed. But then you think about the whole book of Judges. All the judges who are listed, that's several hundred years. And we don't have an account of who is missing between Obed and Jesse. And we'll go through it. All right. Then we have David, King David. Boy, there's so much about King David, isn't there? All the ups and downs of his life. But the thing is, David was known as being a man after what? God's own heart. In no way does that mean David lived this perfect and great life. But he's like us and made mistakes, sometimes tremendous mistakes. But what was he constantly seeking? What was he constantly turning back to? God, wasn't it? He wanted to live a faithful life for God, even though he struggled like all of us do. And that's why I believe he was a man after God's own heart. Bathsheba's not listed by name, but listed as the wife of Uriah. And we know that situation and all the evil that took place. Not only did he commit adultery during that time, but he also put Uriah at the front line so he would get killed in war. And think about David. Was he not just justifying life like we all do? You know what? I'm really not killing him. You know what? It just happens in war. And yep, we're going to put him up there at the front. And yeah, when the heat of the battle, we're going to command everybody else to back up. But you know what? It just happens. We try to justify things. We can easily see where he went with that. A man after God's own heart. The good thing is he didn't let those situations define him. He let the response, as we see in Psalms 51, define who he was for God. But they have a child, Solomon. And this is where Matthew and Luke's account divide. Matthew continues down the line of Solomon, where Luke's account goes through Nathan, a child that David named after the prophet. Rehoboam. This is where the kingdom just kind of starts falling apart. You have Solomon, who really struggles because he has all these wives and concubines, and they start tempting him to fall away from God, start following those idols. But we see that Solomon comes back at the end of his life and talks about vanity of vanities. All is vanity. Everything's meaningless. I had the resources to seek everything I wanted in life, and it's not worth it. But seek God and live for him, as he ends the book of Ecclesiastes. But then he has a son, Rehoboam. And Rehoboam goes and he seeks the wisdom of the old men. And they said, listen, your dad was hard on people. If you want to win the people over, the wise thing to do is to lessen the load a little bit. But then he goes to all of his young friends and he starts talking to them and says, hey, what do you think I should do? And they said, hey, you show what power you have. You let everybody know that you thought my dad was hard. You watch and see what I do. And he listens to the younger men, doesn't he? And now all of a sudden, the kingdom just completely divides. 10 tribes go with Jeroboam. 2 tribes stay with Rehoboam. Judah and Benjamin. So the kingdom is split. Rehoboam is considered evil in the sight of God. He has a son, Abijah. Rehoboam and Abijah did what was evil in the sight of God. They built high places, sacred pillars, Asherah poles, and male prostitutes are there during that time. Think about that for just a minute. We've got David, a man after God's own heart. His son Solomon, who struggles throughout his life but turns back to God. But what influence was there in Rehoboam's life? How many times did he look at his dad, Solomon, and say, hey, he lived evil. Look at all the life. He lived it up. I want to live it up like he did. And he let all of that come in. How many of it, maybe it was his mother or some of these other women that got a hold of Rehoboam to say, hey, my God is more powerful than your God. Look at the great thing my God has done. And sways him. Same thing with Abijah. But then we have Asa. He did what was right in the eyes of God. All of a sudden, he realizes we're not who we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to be. And he starts to bring the people back. He removed idols, the male prostitutes, and his own mother from her position of queen mother because of idolatry. Can you imagine that? Taking your own mother and saying, no, because of the way that you believe, because you're refusing to follow God, you're not a part of this anymore. How difficult do you think that would have been? To look at your own mother and say that. And honestly, you look within the church today, isn't that the thing we struggle with the most? Those family members in our lives that just refuse to love God. And when we want so bad for them, but sometimes we become kind of like Rehoboam. You know what? I still want to hold on to that. I want to make it okay, so I'm going to lessen who I am through them. But what a great lesson from Asa. He said, no, nothing is more important than God. Nothing in this life will get in the place of God. Tough lesson too. And that's one I can easily say, but it's not easy to do. But one lesson that we do need to learn. Jehoshaphat, he followed his father. Asa was a good king as well. But listen to what it says in 1 Kings 22:43. It says, he walked in all the ways of Asa, his father. He did not turn aside from it, doing what was right in the sight of the Lord. But listen, yet the high places were not taken down, and the people still sacrificed and made offerings on the high places. You see what's happening here? It's a nation that's torn. You know what? We love God, but we really don't want to take this out of our life. It doesn't work, does it? Because look at what happens. Even though he was able to stay true, the people weren't. His son, Jehoram, was not a righteous king. That's how the Bible lists him. Why? Because the world that he lived in was divided. Hey, you know what? At home, this is the way we live. But you know what? Out in the world, once we get out of this kingdom, I get to live this way. Eventually, the world won out because he didn't remove those things. As a parent, that's a great lesson for us. Because sometimes there are things within our own household, the things we can control that are evil, that we don't remove from our life. And even though we can stay true to God's word, it doesn't mean that it won't affect our kids. And now we have a situation where the son is not righteous. Look at who he married. Athaliah, the daughter of the wicked king Ahab. Wow. How do you go from living in a household that stays righteous before God to coming home one day and saying, Dad, guess who I'm going to marry? You know, Ahab and Jezebel, they have a daughter. That's who I'm going to marry. 3 kings are now left out between Joram and Uzziah. And 2 of those kings are good kings. But because the Jews wanted a clean list, I guess those are ones they chose to keep out. Uzziah, or Azariah, as some translations say it, and his son Jotham, both are remembered as doing right in the sight of the Lord. So we have about 4 kings through here that do what's right in the sight of the Lord. But listen again. In 2 Kings 15:34 and 35, get to it because I think the bottom of it's taken off. It says, nevertheless, the high places were taken down. The people still sacrificed and made offerings on the high places. Again, another situation where they weren't willing to take the evil out, the things that they could have controlled, and said, I'm going to take it away. They said, I'm not going to do it. And what happens next? We have Ahaz engaged in pagan worship and even sacrificed his own son. Can you imagine this being in the line of Jesus? You're telling me there's a man there who decided to follow idols and believe so much that he takes his only son, or I shouldn't say his only son, one of his sons, and sacrifices his child to this God. Can you imagine? How did you get from these 4 good kings, but these 4 kings decide not to take down the high places and all the evil and the idolatry? And that affects this child so much that he starts following the pagans and sacrifices his own son. Then we have Hezekiah, who is faithful to God. Having destroyed the high places, sacred stones, the Asher poles, and the bronze serpent. He destroys all of it. But it says he destroyed the bronze serpent. What is the bronze serpent? What do we know about the bronze serpent? Yeah, that's right. During the time, and they're wandering through the wilderness. So stop and get a hold of that for just a minute. Think about how many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years have passed from the time they were in the wilderness, and they still have the bronze serpent. And they get the bronze serpent out, and they start worshiping it as an idol. Because whenever they were bitten in the wilderness, because they were complaining, they had all these serpents come, and they were biting them, and the serpents were killing them. But as long as you look at the bronze serpent, you wouldn't die. And they kept it for these hundreds of thousands of years just to worship. And he said, hey, I'm taking that away. He destroyed it. Manasseh and Amon did evil in the sight of God. Then we have Josiah. And do you remember our study about Josiah when we started talking about the book of Daniel? Josiah was the 8-year-old king. And do you remember what he did? What happened as they were rebuilding the temple? What did they find? The book of the law. And he gets the book of the law and he has it read to him. And it means so much to him that he has it read to everybody. He calls everybody together so they can hear the book of the law. Let's find out what God wants for us. Josiah, this great king, restores Israel, brings them back to God. It skips Eliakim. Eliakim was Josiah's son. He ruled for a short amount of time. But after the death of Josiah, we have Jeconiah, and Jeconiah reigned during the time of the deportation. This is when Babylon came in. And Nebuchadnezzar was a general during that time, and he led the charge against the Jews, the Israelites, taking them captive. That's when Daniel was taken captive, and Jeconiah was reigning during that time. Shealtiel. We don't know a whole lot about him. Very little. Zerubbabel was among the Jews who returned to Jerusalem from captivity after the decree of the Persian king Cyrus. So now remember that. Do you remember when King Cyrus, who did he tell to go back, that he could go back and start rebuilding the city, the walls, and the temple? A book's named after him. Starts with an N. Yeah, I'm going to act like you said it. Nehemiah. Good. Yes. Great job. Nehemiah was able to go back. And this is that time, and Zerubbabel is listed as one of those that were able to go back. Now, after Zerubbabel, 9 names cover around 500 years. Now, if you ask a Jew during that time, they probably could have told you everybody between Zerubbabel and Jesus. But it's not listed in Matthew. And mainly because in Jewish history, these guys make very little difference. There's very little known about them. But you got to understand, during this time of captivity, during this time after captivity when they go back, those are over the 400 years that we don't have much information from the Old Testament to the New Testament. That time we talked about where we see that Babylon ruled, and then Persia ruled, and then Greek ruled, and all the way to Roman rule. We don't know a whole lot about that time, except the little we know throughout history. They said after Babylonian captivity, after they came back with this King Cyrus, they said a lot of families didn't know where they came from. They didn't know their family history and their lineage because of all the separation throughout the kingdom. So some of them were not considered full-blooded Jews. They were considered unclean because they didn't know which tribe they actually came from. All right, so notice, somebody read verse 16 and tell me what it says.
Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called the Son.
Jacob, the father of, or may say, begat Joseph. But notice what it says next. The husband of Mary, of who Jesus was born. It doesn't say Joseph, the father of Jesus. That's where all of a sudden the whole conversation changes. Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Christ. Turn over to Luke 2 for just a second. Actually, you can just look at it up here. Verse 23. It says, Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, being the son, as was supposed, of Joseph, the son of Heli. Now, the thing that's different here, we see that it's obviously telling us, being the son as was supposed. It's saying everybody just assumed that he was the son of Joseph. How many times does it say, was not this the carpenter's son? So people, when they talked about Jesus, said Joseph is the father. But then it says the son of Heli. Well, but in Matthew's account it says it was the son of Joseph, the son of Jacob. Heli is considered to be the father of Mary. Mary is supposedly only had sisters, no sons. Son is also, you're able to translate it as descendant. But in this case, it's the son-in-law, but this is why this line is considered to be the line of Mary instead of Joseph, the actual bloodline. Thank you for letting me go through all this. Hopefully it was not too painful, but I do appreciate your patience in listening and your input.